So Spartacus is a pretty remarkable figure. The slave who stood up against his oppressors and wreaked bloody, violent revenge on them. The man who would rather die free than live in chains. Voltaire said about him and his rebellion against Rome that it was the only just war in history. And round about the same time that a French guy was saying that, a fellow who was in a French colony was leading what would eventually become a successful slave rebellion and would be dubbed, of all things, the Black Spartacus. And we have this incredible Stanley Kubrick movie about him. I mean, who doesn't know this scene?
I'm Spartacus!
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 Awesome. It's amazing that even 2,000 years later, Spartacus still looms so large in our imagination as the quintessential freedom fighter. But what exactly made his war the only just one in history? I mean, I guess we could argue whether or not any war can ever truly be just, but this isn't a philosophy channel, so let's see if we can at least figure out whether or not Spartacus had a just cause to fight for. So, what was Spartacus's cause? Well, that's kind of the problem. As we're going to see later on in the video, the sources regarding Spartacus's life are sparse and often contradictory. We don't actually know what his intentions were. And he was ultimately unsuccessful, which means we don't know what he would have done if he had ever achieved the goals that he planned. If he even had a plan. So let's hit pause on the Kubrick for a minute and take a quick gander through the ancient sources and the evidence to see if we can find an ideology to Spartacus, what exactly it was he was fighting for. I mean, was he a revolutionary who was out to destroy or permanently change Rome? Was he just trying to escape slavery and Italy with his plunder and get out of there? Or did he have something else in mind? Okay, so first a little context. Spartacus was born probably in Thrace, it's the best guess we have, modern-day Bulgaria. And he was probably born free and then enslaved by the Romans, as were many slaves at this time. You see, Rome was kind of like the new kid on the block. Their empire had recently been won and it was huge and very impressive, but it was unstable. They were fighting wars on several fronts, they'd had several civil wars, multiple slave uprisings, huge amounts of political turmoil, and the other Italian cities, who didn't really like playing second fiddle to Rome, they never have, had rebelled against them relatively recently in a huge conflict called the Social War. And it's in one of these Italian cities, a place called Capua, that our man Spartacus is in gladiator school. Now, gladiatorial combats are starting to get popular, but they're nowhere near at the level of relevance and importance that they will be later in the empire. Rome doesn't even have a permanent amphitheatre in the city yet. I mean, the Colosseum, that's way off in the future. But Spartacus is part of this growing corner of the entertainment industry that is the blood sports. But Spartacus and about 70 of his friends aren't really into the idea of killing and maiming each other for the entertainment of others, so they kill their masters and they escape to Mount Vesuvius, which isn't erupting at this point and is conveniently just round the corner. So this is the beginning of the revolt, and therefore the natural place to start looking for some kind of ideology or cause of Spartacus. Whatever ideas drove him later might start here with why he decided to take the risk in killing his master and fleeing. Well, our main two sources, these guys, give us two slightly different reasons for why they think Spartacus and his friends initially ran. So Appian tells us that Spartacus convinced his fellow gladiators that it was worth the gamble to be free, to escape, which is a little incomplete. I mean, I'm not denying that the pure human desire to be free might be enough, but what then? What was, they break out of gladiator school and what, do they escape Italy and go home? Do they destroy Rome, just the 70 of them? Do they form their own little independent principality of Vesuvius and just hope everyone leaves them alone? What's the plan here, Appian? Plutarch here is a little more interesting. He says the thing that inspired Spartacus and his fellows to rebel and leave was the unusually cruel treatment they were getting at the hands of their masters, which is an interesting insight into how the Romans viewed slave rebellions. It is worth pointing out that neither Spartacus nor any of his followers left any account of the war, so all of our information about it comes from Romans, or in Plutarch's case, Greeks, who lived long after the events. Some Romans, though not all of them, had a little bit of a habit of blaming slave resistance on the masters themselves. So instead of blaming the whole idea of slavery or having the idea that people might just want to be free for its own sake, it can only come from when one slave master manages his slaves poorly. It's kind of like the Roman idea of a few bad apples, like owning slaves isn't wrong, but owning slaves and abusing power is. We have to remember that these guys who are writing are usually slave owners themselves. And so to soothe their anxiety about the potential of a slave revolt in their own household, but also avoid questioning the social order that they take for granted and benefit from, they like to blame any kind of problems with the slaves on individual bad management. You know, you are a bad master. If you were a good master, your slaves would just behave. And Plutarch, after all, is less of a historian and more of a moralist. He writes biographies. And all of his stories, all of his anecdotes, all of the history that he tells is meant to have a moral lesson at the end of it. So it might not be the case, but it's my interpretation that him sliding in the little fact of, oh, Spartacus had a particularly bad master, and that's why he rebelled, might be a little bit of a moral lesson for his upper class audience. Or maybe he was telling the absolute truth as he heard it, or had some other idea in mind. Either way, Spartacus has killed his masters and escaped, and him and 70 of his mates are on the top of Mount Vesuvius, and they are very quickly besieged by a local Roman militia. But Spartacus is a smart fellow, and he scales some cliffs very secretly in the dead of night using some vines, sneaks behind the Roman camp, kills them all, and takes their weapons. And the Third Servile War is off to a start. So this is our first opportunity to see what Spartacus was actually about. Beforehand, he was the head of 70 blokes just trying to survive. For all we know, he really was only trying to get away from a sadistic master. But now he has an entire army at his back, so what he does next will be a pretty good indication of what exactly this guy wants to achieve. So, what exactly does Spartacus do next? Well, that's a good bloody question. Even our ancient sources seem to be unsure. I mean, they act like they know, but look, here's two maps that I found on Wikipedia showing the movements of Spartacus's army according to the accounts of Plutarch and Appian. As you can see, basically two different narratives. But both narratives touch on two possible motivations for the rebels, the first of which is escape. Both accounts say that Spartacus and his army moved north, and a lot of people take this as evidence that he planned to cross the Alps and escape into Gaul or possibly back to Thrace where he was from. And the second one is plunder. Plutarch says that Spartacus had a fairly hard time controlling his army because a lot of them wanted to head back to the south of Italy and just carry on plundering things. After all, even though this was the only just war in history, it was still a war, and it comes with all the nastiness that ancient warfare entailed. And where there's war, there's opportunists. People who are only in it for the plunder and don't give a damn about the cause. Remember that Spartacus's army at this point is maybe 70,000 strong, and that's not all just escaped slaves and gladiators. A lot of it's also free Italians. Free Italians who may have just wanted to plunder rival cities round the corner. Some have theorized that there was even a factional split amongst the slave army at this point. I mean, Spartacus is not the only named leader of the rebels. Perhaps this army was considerably less unified than has been suggested by our ancient sources. Which might be true, but it looks like the slave army stayed roughly together for the duration of the rebellion, and there are other explanations for why they're occasionally found divided off from each other. I mean, this is a group of 70,000 people living off the land. You can't keep them all together all of the time just in case the Romans attack. They'll starve. There isn't enough food and provisions in one place. And if Spartacus did indeed want to go home, but half of his army wanted to stay, he'd already defeated the Roman army that was in his way. He could have just left and gone back to Thrace or gone back to Gaul and left the rest of the rebels in the south of Italy. Or maybe he wanted some plunder himself. Maybe he wanted to leave Italy not only a free man, but a rich man. We'll never know, however, because even though he starts with the upper hand, the war very quickly turns against Spartacus as soon as the Roman legions are put under the command of one Marcus Licinius Crassus, a very disreputable man. And he traps Spartacus in the southern tip of the boot of Italy. And on top of that, two other Roman armies, one from Spain, one from Macedonia, are closing in. So, with three armies closing in on him, Spartacus finds himself trapped in the very southern tip of Italy. Calabria is a lovely place. Beautiful views, fantastic food. Not ideal if you're trapped by Roman legions though, because you're surrounded on three sides by sea. So Spartacus, who is running out of options, hires a couple of pirates to ferry him to safety. He does the usual deal that you do with criminals. Here's half the money now, and you can have the other half when I'm there. And safety, as far as Spartacus is concerned, is the island of Sicily. And Sicily is a significant place, because Spartacus's rebellion is called the Third Servile War. There had been the First and Second Servile War only a couple of decades before, and both of those were based on the island of Sicily. And this is because Sicily was an agricultural gold mine to the Romans, filled with slaves working the fields, living in awful conditions with a history of rebellion. In other words, the perfect place to find new recruits. And there may have been more to it than that. In those first two slave revolts, the slaves had raised prophets or kings to be their leaders, and they'd had this centralized leadership, almost as if they were trying to form their own state of rebels. It may be that Spartacus wanted to create a Sicilian kingdom where he would go and free the slaves and then become their king. And then from their island realm, they would more easily be able to maintain their autonomy from Rome, who was fighting wars in east and west. And then he would be the great king Spartacus, the undefeated breaker of chains. And, you know, this is entirely too much conjecture. I mean, I guess it's perfectly possible that Spartacus wanted to break away from Rome, or maybe even change it from within or destroy it. The idea of Spartacus the revolutionary is quite interesting. There's a bit in Appian when he talks about Spartacus's march north after he defeats another Roman army, that he contemplates the idea of even marching on the city of Rome, but then decides that he's not powerful enough to do that and abandons the idea. In his book on Spartacus, Aldo Schiavone speculates that Spartacus was less of a renegade rebel leader and more a social revolutionary. That maybe he wanted to unite the discontent lower classes of Italy and rekindle the fires of the social war as himself the leader, a radical political figure. Or maybe he wanted to destroy Rome itself and create a new realm in Italy for himself, like an Italian Sertorius. But sadly, it just requires too much conjecture, as the author himself admits. I mean, it's a perfectly plausible idea, but the evidence just isn't there. In fact, I reckon that a lot of the evidence is even against that idea. I get the same interpretation as Keith Bradley, who's another ancient historian, and he reckons that Spartacus never really had a coherent plan for the rebellion. Bradley sees no grand ideological idea for Spartacus. The way he sees it is that he and 70 slaves escaped their masters in Capua with no intention to start a 3-year-long slave war that will consume all of Italy. But the way things turn out, he ends up with 70,000 followers behind him, a huge, great big army of discontent and disunited peoples, and he just has to respond to circumstances as they present themselves. With this narrative, Spartacus grows in power with every success, but he also gets closer and closer to his inevitable defeat. He starts as a slave who longs to be free, so he and 70 of his pals escape and try and hide on Mount Vesuvius, but they're discovered and besieged, so he cleverly goes around the back of the Romans, kills them, and, takes their weapons. But now he's an actual threat, so he has to fight real, genuine Roman armies, which he does successfully because he's a military genius. But more and more escaped slaves and other dissidents and people start flocking to him, so now he has a massive host that he has to feed. So he has to sack cities and stay in Italy and go around and find resources to keep these people supplied. Eventually he ends up trapped in the south of Italy, and then he hires pirates to take him to Sicily purely because he needs somewhere to go. And that's what I also think was going through Spartacus's mind this entire time. just constantly reacting to the new circumstances as they presented themselves in front of him, and not calculating every decision he made to fit into some grand plan that he might have had. Not that it mattered anyway, because remember those pirates who Spartacus made a deal with, where they'd take him to Sicily and he'd give them half the gold now and half when they got there? Well, having already made a profit and not really wanting to get on the wrong side of the all-powerful Romans, the pirates just leave with half his money and completely abandon him there in the south of Italy. And so, Spartacus, forced to adapt to circumstance, has no choice but to turn round and face the vastly superior Roman army. And he does his best, but he loses, and he is probably killed in the battle. None of his supporters are any luckier, by the way. The ancient sources make it sound like nobody got out. I mean, 6,000 of them tried, but they were captured and crucified along the Appian Way, all 6,000 of them, all the way from Rome to Capua. A grisly reminder of what the Romans did to those who opposed them. And because his ideas and objectives are obscured by the mists of time and he was ultimately unsuccessful in achieving them, we can continue to use Spartacus as the poster boy for freedom fighting, protesting, fighting against oppression. Doesn't matter. We can all stand up and say, I am Spartacus, and have it mean something, because, well, it means nothing, and therefore it can really mean anything, can't it? So I guess the moral of this story is... Oh, it's finished. Sorry, I must have talked through the last bit. Kirk Douglas gets crucified. Oh, and he has to fight his best friend to the death. It's a good movie.